What if the official start date of the most televised war in modern history was a complete fabrication? The official press briefings delivered from the perfectly polished podiums in Washington were feeding the global public an absolute fabrication regarding the opening moments of the monumental conflict. While the mainstream television networks were busy broadcasting carefully orchestrated press conferences, politicians were meticulously calculating the exact diplomatic moment to announce the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom. A completely different and utterly staggering reality was already unfolding in the suffocating darkness of the hostile desert. The entire world was firmly led to believe that the monumental conflict officially began on the 20th of March. But the undeniable and highly classified truth is that a rogue phantom unit had already crossed the border more than 30 hours earlier. The United States military establishment was frantically finalizing its colossal invasion timeline, organizing its massive satellite uplinks on the Kuwaiti border. They were meticulously preparing an unstoppable wave of conventional forces to violently sweep across the region, heavily relying on overwhelming industrial might and an absolute surplus of heavy armored divisions. Meanwhile, a tiny, almost invisible column of Australian operators belonging to the elite Task Force 64 was already tearing through the vast western desert. They drove completely without headlights, without radio traffic, and completely hidden from the knowledge of most of the coalition command structure. The exact date was the 18th of March, and these elite warriors were already deeply entrenched in an explosive and highly volatile conflict. The rest of the planet had not even tuned in to watch this incredibly daring, entirely off-the-grid military infiltration deep inside enemy territory. These incredibly brave men were absolutely not patiently waiting for the green light from high-ranking bureaucrats sitting comfortably in heavily guarded, air-conditioned offices across the ocean. They had entirely bypassed the endless political red tape, slipping through the treacherous shadows like absolute phantoms. They were actively carrying out a mission so highly classified that even top-tier Allied commanders were completely oblivious to their presence and their unprecedented operational objectives. The sheer unadulterated audacity of sending a handful of men into deeply hostile territory remains an astonishing historical secret of the modern era. They were operating long before the night sky filled with Allied aircraft, and long before the heavily armored columns began their thunderous advance from the south. But this shocking defiance of the official invasion timeline was merely the prelude to a staggering revelation that would permanently shatter the enormous pride of the American military machine. A highly decorated United States Army liaison officer was securely attached to the Australian command element during this incredibly tense opening phase. He was completely unprepared for the terrifying reality of this rogue, unsupported desert mission. This highly decorated American officer was about to witness a tactical approach so seemingly suicidal, it permanently shattered his understanding of modern combat. He later described what he witnessed in those frantic first hours as the absolute most disorienting professional experience of his entire military career. This was an incredibly seasoned American officer who had spent his entire life studying, worshiping, and fiercely executing the renowned United States military doctrine of overwhelming force. This strategy was widely known within the Pentagon corridors as the rigid, heavily supported POW doctrine of modern warfare. He had been explicitly taught that total victory was exclusively guaranteed by deploying massive armored divisions and utilizing unlimited close air support. This aggressive doctrine demanded concentrating devastating firepower to ensure the opposing enemy's capacity to forcefully resist collapsed completely and simultaneously. He understood warfare strictly as a massive problem of logistical scale, where you assemble a heavily armed force large enough to be completely decisive. You must provide it with an endless tail of supply trucks to miraculously sustain its forward momentum across the incredibly dangerous and unpredictable modern battlefield. Instead of eagerly witnessing a colossal, earth-shattering display of massive industrial military might, this completely stunned American officer watched something entirely different. He closely observed a handful of rugged Australian men in completely unarmored vehicles quickly disappearing into 300,000 square kilometers of fiercely hostile, wide-open desert. They completely lacked the standard protective umbrella of heavy artillery, massive logistical convoys, or a heavily defended forward operating base to safely retreat toward. The terrifying vulnerability of this incredibly small vanguard force directly contradicted absolutely everything the American military establishment passionately believed in. The astonishing orders forcefully given to these independent operators were not to simply patrol the hostile area cautiously, nor were they instructed to quietly observe enemy motorized movements from a safe, comfortable distance, or to bravely report back and patiently wait for heavily armed reinforcements to arrive and save the day. The direct, entirely mind-boggling orders violently pushed down from the top command were to absolutely control that colossal expanse of contested territory. They had to achieve this monumental task using absolutely nothing but their own vehicles, their personal weapons, and raw determination. They were expected to completely dominate this massive arena, strictly relying upon their unparalleled tactical brilliance and relentless aggression. The vital distinction between merely observing a disputed territory and actively controlling it with such an incredibly minuscule force was a radical operational concept. The rigid, incredibly formulaic American military training had absolutely never prepared this decorated liaison officer to properly comprehend this aggressive strategy. He struggled to accept it as a highly realistic operational possibility, firmly believing that this rogue deployment would inevitably result in a spectacular, deeply tragic military disaster. Yet, the absolute nightmare of this unprecedented tactical assignment was incredibly only just beginning to reveal its true terrifying face to the embedded observer. Politicians in Washington and London were fiercely orchestrating a massive, highly deceptive media narrative that deliberately portrayed a perfectly synchronized, unstoppable coalition front. They excitedly brought in hundreds of carefully embedded journalists, enthusiastically promising them front-row seats to the absolute greatest display of synchronized military power in modern history. The global public blindly consumed this heavily sanitized narrative, completely oblivious to the desperate, terrifying gamble unfolding in the darkness. While those eager reporters were carefully pointed toward the heavily armored divisions safely moving in the deeply contested South, a different reality existed. The true vanguard of the massive invasion was already operating deep behind heavily fortified enemy lines, completely cut off from the massive media spectacle. These Australian operators were fighting entirely on their own uncompromising terms, completely isolated from any external support or emergency medical evacuation capabilities. They were intentionally operating in the absolute deepest shadows of the conflict, carrying the massive burden of an incredibly sensitive intelligence mandate. The American liaison officer could not simply shake off the intense psychological dissonance of silently watching this terrifying military operation unfold. It completely stripped away absolutely every single safety measure he had ever been forcefully taught to rely upon for his own physical survival on the battlefield. In the highly traditional, incredibly cautious American method of conducting modern warfare, a unit taking direct contact with a heavily armed hostile force acts immediately. The standard protocol dictates frantically calling upon a massive protective umbrella of aggressive close air support and rapid medical evacuation helicopters. Heavily armed reaction forces are normally waiting on immediate standby to aggressively neutralize any unexpected threats and forcefully extract the pinned-down troops. However, for the deeply committed Australian operators aggressively hunting in the unforgiving Western Desert, that standard protective umbrella simply did not exist in any functional capacity whatsoever. This complete absence of external security measures left them entirely exposed to the brutal, unforgiving realities of their incredibly dangerous and highly classified military profession. They were completely alone in the endless void, willingly trusting their very survival to the incredibly fragile machinery of their rovers. If a clandestine operation went terribly wrong, or if a light vehicle suffered a catastrophic mechanical breakdown in the middle of the hostile wasteland, disaster loomed. If they unexpectedly encountered a heavily armed, highly mobile enemy battalion actively patrolling the dunes, there was absolutely no glorious American cavalry coming over the horizon. No heavily armored rescue force would miraculously appear to quickly save them from a deeply tragic and highly classified end in the scorching sand. This terrifying reality forced the operators to maintain an intense, almost superhuman level of constant battlefield hypervigilance during every single moment. This was absolutely not merely a standard military operation casually constructed by brilliant academic strategists sitting in highly secure subterranean bunkers. It was an incredibly high-stakes survival mission conducted directly against both a heavily armed, highly motivated indigenous enemy and the merciless, completely indifferent forces of nature. The sweeping violent winds, the sudden blinding dust storms, and the severely dropping nighttime temperatures constantly threatened to aggressively grind the entire operation to a halt. The incredibly brutal environment itself was an impartial adversary that promised a spectacular, completely unforgettable failure if they made a single miscalculation. Despite the overwhelming psychological pressure and the completely terrifying odds stacked aggressively against them, these fiercely independent warriors continued their relentless high-speed desert advance. They expertly utilized the sheer vastness of the empty terrain to completely mask their aggressive movements from the heavily armed enemy patrols, constantly scouring the region. Their unprecedented infiltration was an absolute masterclass in unconventional warfare, deliberately breaking absolutely every single established rule of modern combat to achieve a seemingly impossible objective. The attached American liaison officer could only watch in pure astonishment as this phantom force systematically conquered the impossible. The sheer level of absolute secrecy intensely surrounding this daring, entirely unprecedented operational infiltration remains one of the most heavily guarded scandals of the entire campaign. It was deliberately kept far out of the mainstream media headlines to desperately protect the highly fragile egos of top-tier conventional military planners. Acknowledging the spectacular success of this tiny, unsupported force would forcefully invalidate decades of highly expensive, strictly conventional military doctrine strictly taught in prestigious academies. The political establishment simply could not publicly admit that a handful of rogue operators achieved what massive armored divisions could not. Every single silent maneuver executed by Task Force 64 Inches, those frantic opening hours successfully laid the critical groundwork for a monumental operational shift. They actively weaponized the terrifying emptiness of the scorching desert against an incredibly arrogant enemy that falsely believed the brutal environment would reliably serve as protection. The massive Iraqi defense grid, specifically designed to forcefully repel a conventional, slow-moving armored invasion, was completely unprepared for this terrifyingly fast, invisible phantom threat. The opposing commanders were absolutely blind to the rapidly approaching disaster actively creeping through the cold desert night. They weren't sent to merely observe the vast, hostile wasteland. They were strictly ordered to absolutely control it against staggering, completely overwhelming odds. But what truly terrified the highly decorated American observer wasn't just the seemingly suicidal nature of their incredibly dangerous, unsupported desert mission profile. It was the deeply classified, highly terrifying knowledge of exactly what kind of world-ending threat was quietly waiting for these brave men in the dark. The terrifying geopolitical secret hidden securely beneath the desert sands carried the massive, absolute potential to instantly plunge the entire world into unstoppable chaos. To truly grasp the monumental magnitude of what Task Force 64 successfully achieved during those opening hours, we must look at the environment. To understand their miraculous victory, you must first understand the geographical nightmare that was actively trying to kill them. The province of Al-Anbar and the surrounding desert territory assigned exclusively to these Australian operators represents roughly one-third of the entire landmass of the embattled nation. That terrifying geographic statistic requires a significant moment to fully register in the mind of anyone accustomed to conventional warfare where giant armies fight bitterly. We are talking about an unforgiving stretch of deeply hostile territory roughly the size of the American states of California, Nevada, and Arizona, combined perfectly into one massive desolate arena of suffering. This is an environment of extreme and relentless hostility where the brutal landscape is completely flat, terrifyingly featureless, and stretches endlessly across vast sections of the burning horizon. The western Iraqi desert is brutally and mercilessly scorching hot during the daylight hours, violently baking absolutely everything beneath the punishing, unfiltered sun with immense radiant energy. This scorching daytime inferno quickly transitions into something equally lethal when the sun finally sets. The harsh landscape violently becomes freezing cold at night, suddenly dropping to terrifying temperatures that absolutely require serious thermal protection just to prevent an absolute physical tragedy from claiming the isolated operators. The harsh, unforgiving terrain is only crisscrossed by extremely rudimentary road networks that heavily favored highly mobile local defenders. This desolate geographical layout naturally destroyed any conventional attacking army permanently burdened by slow, incredibly heavy, and highly vulnerable logistical supply chains. Furthermore, this deeply desolate wasteland offered absolutely no natural cover or physical concealment to the advancing troops. It provided absolutely nothing beyond the intense visual distortion of the heavy heat shimmer and the occasional dry riverbed cutting violently through the dusty, unyielding desert floor. There was absolutely nowhere to hide in any conventional military sense, nowhere to securely anchor a solid defensive line against a counterattack. There was completely zero elevated terrain that could be securely held according to the standard military doctrines eagerly taught in prestigious global academies. However, what would undoubtedly represent an inescapable deadly trap for heavily burdened ordinary soldiers miraculously became the ultimate tactical hunting ground for these undisputed masters of the wasteland. It was an incredibly vast geographical space that was enormously vast, completely unforgiving, and entirely indifferent to the grand political ambitions of any conventional army foolish enough to intrude. While the massive American and British conventional forces were aggressively pushing north from the heavily fortified Kuwaiti border, they were operating in a fundamentally different environment with highly supported mission parameters entirely. Those massive conventional Allied armies had the incredibly heavy armor, the relentless artillery cover, the endless logistical infrastructure, and the sheer massive bulk of human personnel physically required. This immense weight was specifically needed to forcefully carve their bloody way through the heavily contested southern approaches without facing immediate annihilation. They were entirely custom-built to aggressively secure the lucrative oil infrastructure and forcefully drive straight toward the capital city through densely populated, incredibly fertile river corridors where the ultimate political contest would ultimately be violently decided. Every single highly intelligent mind permanently stationed within the upper echelons of the coalition planning structure understood one crucial tactical reality perfectly well. Sending a slow, heavily armored conventional force into the unforgiving western desert would instantly and inevitably result in an absolute logistical catastrophe of purely epic proportions. The critically important Western Desert mission fundamentally required a highly specific, incredibly rare set of lethal combat skills that the standard bureaucratic military machine simply could not rapidly provide under any circumstances, regardless of the immense funding violently thrown around. This unprecedented mission directly demanded the seemingly impossible physical ability to aggressively cover an enormous, highly hostile territory with extreme, terrifying speed. The elite operators absolutely had to utilize an incredibly minimal number of personnel to successfully avoid actively drawing unwanted attention from heavily armed enemy patrols constantly roaming the area. More importantly, these ghost-like Australian operators had perfectly adapted themselves to strictly function completely independently of the massive supply chains and comforting support structures. The traditional American military doctrine foolishly treated these fragile logistical lifelines as absolute baseline combat requirements. Exactly within this fiercely blistering furnace of total despair, the true terrifying nature of the Australian elite forces was finally, violently unleashed upon an unsuspecting indigenous adversary. This is exactly the highly terrifying juncture where the Australian Special Air Service Regiment proved undeniably that they permanently operate on a completely different level of extreme human endurance. Their sheer tactical superiority compared to absolutely anyone else on the chaotic, highly explosive battlefield was undeniable to any rational observer. They were a completely different breed of predator hunting in the darkness. While regular, conventional Allied armies were anxiously spending countless months meticulously learning how to cautiously move massive, highly vulnerable supply convoys through hostile terrain, the Australians were different. They had fiercely spent several decades intensely training for exactly this kind of terrifying, completely isolated operational survival problem. The deeply unforgiving outback of their native homeland had effectively forged these deeply resilient men into fiercely independent, highly lethal warriors. They thrived spectacularly in horrific environmental conditions that would easily break the fragile spirit and physical health of standard conventional military troops. They were absolutely not merely surviving in the terrifying, expansive wasteland while waiting anxiously for heavy reinforcements to eventually arrive. They were actively and aggressively weaponizing the vast emptiness of the scorching desert against a heavily armed, highly arrogant indigenous enemy. This defending force falsely believed the brutal, unforgiving environment would reliably serve as an impenetrable geographical shield against any audacious foreign invaders. The sheer level of absolute operational secrecy permanently surrounding this daring, entirely unprecedented rapid infiltration remains one of the most heavily guarded military scandals of the war. It was deliberately and aggressively kept far out of the mainstream global media headlines to desperately protect the highly fragile professional egos of conventional military planners in Washington. The attached American liaison officer could absolutely not simply shake off the intense psychological dissonance of watching a military operation strip away every single safety measure. The incredibly sophisticated military hardware aggressively deployed by the standard conventional coalition forces looked absolutely pathetic compared to the terrifying, stripped-down machines aggressively driven by these fiercely renegade Australian elite special operations personnel. You must forget absolutely everything you have ever seen in glossy, highly sanitized military magazines beautifully showcasing heavily armored tanks and massive, impenetrable troop carriers. Those incredibly heavy vehicles are fundamentally designed to keep ordinary soldiers perfectly safe from any incoming hostile ballistic harm. The fearless, highly aggressive men of Task Force 64 were completely and violently rewriting the rigid standard rulebook of modern vehicular combat. They achieved this by aggressively riding directly into the highly hostile abyss on heavily modified long-range patrol vehicles, resembling absolute dystopian nightmares. These highly customized, incredibly fast desert rovers had been ruthlessly and intentionally stripped of absolutely every single ounce of heavy defensive protective armor. They deliberately removed any form of thick physical protection that a normal, conventionally trained American soldier would desperately beg for on his knees before crossing the heavily defended border. In the brutally unforgiving, highly calculated calculus of the elite special operations forces, thick steel plates were directly and enthusiastically traded for achieving absolute maximum speed across the shifting sands to outmaneuver the much heavier enemy forces. This terrifying speed was heavily combined with an absolutely staggering amount of raw, unadulterated offensive firepower that could easily level a small fortified desert village in seconds, instead of nervously hiding behind thick, highly advanced ballistic glass waiting for air support. These incredibly fierce, highly trained warriors chose pure aggressive momentum. They securely mounted incredibly devastating heavy machine guns directly onto their totally exposed structural roll cages. This extreme modification actively transformed light utility transport trucks into highly lethal, hyper-aggressive apex predators of the endless, unforgiving western desert wasteland. Even more shockingly to the incredibly rigid American tactical doctrine, they securely fastened highly advanced, incredibly expensive Javelin anti-tank guided missile systems to their open-frame vehicles. Any conventional general would scream in pure panic at their arsenal. Highly sophisticated bunker-busting missiles strapped to completely unarmored dune buggies. This was a purely radical, extremely dangerous tactical decision that fundamentally defied absolutely every conventional military manual ever written on proper missile deployment. Placing a highly sophisticated, incredibly sensitive weapon system on an entirely unarmored dune buggy was considered pure, undeniable insanity. Standard Pentagon strategists firmly viewed this bizarre vehicular configuration as either a stroke of unparalleled, utterly insane tactical genius or pure, undeniable suicidal intent. Yet, these fiercely independent elite operators knew exactly what they were doing in the desolate wasteland, firmly carrying enough concentrated explosive power to instantly vaporize massive enemy armored columns. They could violently achieve this absolute destruction before the heavily armed opposing indigenous forces even slightly realized they were under a massive, perfectly coordinated missile assault. The sheer firepower violently compacted onto these light rovers was totally breathtaking. But the absolute most unbelievable, deeply terrifying aspect of their impressive desert arsenal was a horrifying logistical secret that left the attached American command structure utterly speechless. The highly decorated United States military liaison officer had proudly spent his entire illustrious career strictly operating under one unbreakable, fundamental assumption regarding modern warfare. He deeply believed that sustained combat strictly required a massive, never-ending chain of heavy supply trucks constantly delivering vital fuel, clean water, and heavy ammunition to the front. He assumed this logistical tail was an absolute necessity. During those incredibly tense, highly explosive opening days of the monumental international conflict, he patiently and anxiously waited for the inevitable arrival of the massive logistical convoys. These massive, heavy supply vehicles were theoretically supposed to safely and securely sustain the isolated Australian operators deep behind heavily fortified enemy lines. He naturally assumed that somewhere just over the burning, completely barren horizon, a massive, heavily armed fleet of heavy transport vehicles was aggressively racing through the blinding sand. He believed they were coming to forcefully provide these isolated men with necessities. He deeply believed this massive phantom supply chain was absolutely required to effectively prevent a complete, incredibly tragic operational collapse in the blistering heat. It painfully took several agonizing, highly confusing days for this highly decorated American officer to finally realize the absolute terrifying truth of their completely isolated tactical situation. As the days dragged on, the terrifying truth finally dawned on the American liaison. Absolutely no backup was coming. There was positively no heavy backup, no medical evacuation helicopters, and absolutely zero logistical convoys ever coming to save them. These incredibly tough, highly resilient Australian operators had deliberately and aggressively driven deep into heavily fortified, heavily contested enemy territory entirely alone. They crossed the dangerous border with absolutely nothing but the highly flammable fuel currently stored in their primary tanks and the heavy ammunition aggressively strapped to their fragile vehicles. Their own unshakable psychological confidence and complete mastery of the hostile desert environment replaced the massive logistical safety nets that standard armies desperately relied upon for basic survival. They operated on a completely radical, highly dangerous survival assumption. They fiercely believed they would successfully survive entirely on a single massive fuel load, efficiently covering extraordinary, seemingly impossible distances across the treacherous, unyielding wasteland. They deliberately planned to completely bypass any need to loudly and dangerously call for emergency medical helicopter resupplies that would instantly compromise their hidden position. They carried their entire comprehensive survival package strictly on their unarmored structural frames, actively laughing directly in the face of rigid conventional military doctrine. The traditional manuals explicitly stated such an unsupported combat unit would instantly collapse into absolute utter tragedy. The sheer terrifying bravery and extreme physical endurance strictly required to totally sever all communication ties to the safety of a heavily defended forward operating base was astonishing. To completely disappear into a totally hostile, heavily armed void is a sensational historical testament to a level of psychological endurance that the standard military machine simply cannot manufacture. They violently rejected continuous massive external support, strictly relying on their intense training and flawless operational execution to avoid total annihilation. The American observer was entirely paralyzed by their unprecedented sheer tactical audacity. Yet, the terrifying audacity of their completely unsupported, highly aggressive vehicular charge into the total darkness violently pales in direct comparison to their actual hidden objective. Their mission was absolutely not just about aggressively surviving the brutal elements or successfully demonstrating their unmatched physical superiority against the deeply hostile desert environment. But surviving the desert was merely the prologue to the apocalyptic nightmare they had been sent to prevent. They were desperately hunting something incredibly dangerous, completely hidden from the global public eye by incredibly anxious Pentagon intelligence officials. The heavily armored conventional coalition forces slowly moving in the south had absolutely no idea about the rapidly ticking, completely invisible doomsday clock actively counting down. The extremely isolated operators of Task Force 64 were the absolute only human beings actively standing firmly between an incredibly fragile international coalition and total absolute annihilation. They completely understood that a single terrifying operational failure in the scorching wasteland would instantly and permanently trigger an unprecedented global catastrophe of unimaginable, horrific proportions. The silent war had officially begun in the deadly shadows. You must desperately ask yourself what kind of monumental, world-ending threat could possibly force the highest echelons of the global military command to risk such an unbelievably reckless and highly classified infiltration. While mainstream networks obsessed over heavily guarded presidential palaces, top-tier Pentagon analysts were losing sleep over a completely different, world-ending threat. They were absolutely not focused on the heavily publicized conventional battles actively raging in the deeply contested southern oil fields or the distant, heavily fortified capital city. The incredibly terrifying scenario that generated an unprecedented level of absolute panic within the highest levels of the coalition planning process remained heavily classified. It had absolutely nothing to do with the dramatic, highly televised, armored push toward the political center of the fractured nation. The deeply terrifying reality aggressively kept perfectly hidden from the evening news broadcasts was that the enemy regime secretly retained highly functional, extremely mobile ballistic missile launchers. These highly lethal weapons were perfectly concealed within the vast, completely uncharted expanse of the harsh western desert. These were the completely infamous, highly destructive Scud missile systems, and they were deliberately kept far away from the advancing conventional Allied forces. They were absolutely not pointed at the incredibly massive American armored divisions violently pushing north across the heavily fortified border. Rather, these highly elusive mobile ballistic rockets were deliberately and aggressively aimed directly at the heavily populated, incredibly vulnerable civilian centers of neighboring Israel. The brilliant, highly anxious coalition strategist knew with absolute, terrifying certainty exactly what a successful strike would instantly accomplish. A successfully executed ballistic missile strike on an entirely sovereign allied nation actively remaining strictly outside the immediate operational conflict zone would be completely catastrophic. It would instantly and permanently transform a strictly localized military intervention into an absolutely uncontrollable, violently explosive region-wide tragedy of epic proportions. If those heavily concealed rockets were successfully launched from the barren wasteland, the targeted sovereign nation would absolutely and undeniably unleash a spectacular, overwhelming military retaliation. This aggressive counterstrike would permanently shatter the fragile international coalition completely. This highly explosive geopolitical powder keg dangerously resting in the western sands held a secondary, significantly more sinister operational secret that severely threatened millions. The highly classified, deeply sensitive intelligence reports constantly circulating through the highest, most restricted levels of the coalition command structure carried a terrifying addendum. These highly elusive, rapidly mobile Scud missiles could potentially be heavily armed with absolutely horrific, highly lethal chemical or biological payloads. The catastrophic consequences of such a devastating weapon successfully detonating over a major metropolitan civilian area were completely unthinkable. The mere agonizing thought of a catastrophic biological tragedy violently raining down from the dark night sky onto incredibly dense civilian populations was entirely paralyzing. It sent massive, uncontrollable shockwaves of pure, unadulterated terror directly through the restricted ranks of the elite global strategic military planners. This was no longer a fight for a patch of worthless sand. It was a desperate race to stop a biological tragedy that would inevitably trigger the third global conflict. The incredibly fragile political framework would instantly vaporize. The very exact second one of those massive, highly volatile ballistic missiles successfully ignited its fiery rocket engines, the entire diplomatic world would inevitably burn. Therefore, the absolute monumental burden of actively saving the entire civilized world from an entirely irreversible, absolutely horrific global disaster was quietly reassigned. It was decisively and forcefully placed squarely onto the incredibly broad, highly resilient shoulders of the elite operators belonging strictly to Task Force 64. The highly anxious, deeply terrified command nervously looked at the map. They pointed their trembling fingers directly toward a massive, incredibly hostile geographical area, roughly the size of 3 major American states combined together. They explicitly gave the incredibly small, highly isolated Australian contingent a single, entirely uncompromising tactical mandate that completely defied absolutely all standard military logic. They were explicitly and forcefully ordered to rapidly flood the violently scorching desert, relentlessly hunt down the incredibly elusive, highly mobile ballistic missile launchers. They had to completely erase this terrifying variable entirely. It was an absolutely apocalyptic, highly demanding operational mandate, forcefully handed directly to a completely tiny group of fiercely independent, highly fearless men. They were actively riding in brutally stripped down, entirely unarmored desert buggies, completely and utterly cut off from the rest of the colossal military apparatus. The intense, highly suffocating psychological pressure of this rapidly ticking doomsday clock aggressively pushed these elite warriors to continuously perform completely unbelievable tactical feats. They demonstrated absolute tactical brilliance and unparalleled physical endurance continuously. The deeply committed, highly professional Australian operators understood perfectly well the immense gravity of their completely unsupported, highly classified nocturnal desert infiltration mission. The monumental, undeniable fate of millions of completely innocent, highly vulnerable civilians rested directly and exclusively upon their unique, unparalleled physical ability. They had to aggressively move significantly faster than the enemy's incredibly complex, deeply entrenched internal command and control decision cycle. They flawlessly utilized the sheer, absolute breathtaking speed and completely devastating heavy firepower effectively. They systematically and aggressively dismantled any localized indigenous resistance long before the opposing defending commanders could ever successfully orient to the rapidly evolving tactical threat. Moving entirely silently under the heavy protective cover of total, absolute nocturnal darkness, they rapidly became absolute, undisputed masters of the harsh geographical terrain. They expertly and efficiently utilized the natural visual heat shimmers and deeply carved dry riverbeds to completely mask their highly aggressive approach vectors from entirely terrified enemy forward scouts constantly scanning. They were absolutely not just a standard conventional military force, strictly executing a simple, entirely routine everyday tactical objective in a foreign country. They were a highly precise, incredibly lethal surgical instrument of international salvation, operating permanently with a terrifying level of cold, highly calculated precision. The global military establishment had absolutely never witnessed this specific, highly refined brand of aggressive operational independence before this chaotic conflict initially began. The intense, completely suffocating pressure of constantly hunting these weapons was immense. This absolutely massive burden violently forced these fiercely independent elite operators to constantly and relentlessly maintain an impossible level of intense situational awareness. It was a psychological state of absolute hypervigilance that securely borders strictly on the completely superhuman, permanently pushing human endurance beyond normal biological limits. Every single deceptive, shifting shadow in the vast empty desert, every single massive rolling plume of choking dust appearing on the distant horizon mattered immensely. Every thermal anomaly briefly caught required immediate, violent confrontation. Each potential threat had to be aggressively and violently confronted, without a single, momentary fraction of a second of deadly tactical hesitation or fear. They were relentlessly hunting highly mobile, incredibly dangerous weapons of mass devastation, hidden perfectly in an environment that actively tried to violently eliminate them. They relied entirely and solely on their physically punishing, highly specialized training and their heavily armed, completely unarmored, highly vulnerable desert rovers. The breathtaking reality preventing an absolute global tragedy remains entirely astounding. This sensational, highly classified truth regarding how these elite operators completely operated entirely off the official Allied grid is actively ignored today. The heavily sanitized, officially published history books desperately try to completely ignore their unprecedented, unsupported sacrifice to desperately protect conventional military bureaucratic egos. They were aggressively fighting a heavily concealed, entirely apocalyptic ticking doomsday clock, while the completely oblivious global population confidently watched highly censored television broadcasts constantly. The mainstream media exclusively focused entirely on the spectacular, highly coordinated aerial bombing campaigns. The elite operators possessed absolutely no margin for a seventanical error, no possibility for hesitation, and completely zero allowance for failure in the brutal wasteland. The fate of millions was quietly placed on the shoulders of a force small enough to fit inside a high school gymnasium, and the ticking clock was about to run out. The heavily armed indigenous defending forces were desperately preparing to finally launch the apocalyptic weapons hidden deep within the treacherous western sands immediately. The absolute most violent desert confrontation was now completely inevitable. When the highly anticipated military confrontation finally materialized in the blistering heat of the unforgiving desert, it permanently shattered every established rule of modern tactical engagement. According to every prestigious military academy, a heavily outnumbered patrol caught in the open desert has only one option: retreat. Task Force 64 chose the exact opposite. The fiercely independent Australian operators suddenly found themselves facing a massively superior indigenous force perfectly adapted to the harsh, unrelenting environment of the treacherous wasteland. This was absolutely not a typical, highly anticipated conventional engagement. These heavily armed opposing military units were absolutely not the heavily armored Republican Guard formations that conventional American planners had constantly obsessed over in their comfortable briefing rooms back in Washington. The local defending forces were highly mobile, fiercely aggressive enemy combatants, operating light vehicles equipped with incredibly devastating heavy weapons. They were perfectly designed to quickly swarm and completely overwhelm any foreign intruders foolish enough to brazenly enter their heavily fortified sovereign territory. The completely outmatched Australian forces were instantly thrust into an incredibly dangerous and explosive motorized confrontation. The standard military doctrine strictly demands establishing a hasty defensive perimeter in the burning sand and desperately screaming into encrypted radios for massive emergency air support. But the fearless and entirely unorthodox men of this rogue phantom unit operated on a completely different and utterly terrifying psychological frequency that left conventional commanders speechless. Instead of cowardly falling back into a standard defensive posture and waiting for heavily armed backup that was never coming, they immediately pushed the throttle forward. They relentlessly and violently attacked the vastly superior opposing indigenous force directly. This unprecedented display of sheer tactical audacity completely paralyzed the heavily armed defending commanders who had absolutely never in their wildest nightmares anticipated such aggression. They were entirely stunned by this seemingly suicidal level of intense violence erupting from a radically smaller and entirely unarmored vanguard force. The highly trained Australian operators rapidly unleashed their incredibly sophisticated Javelin missile systems, transforming the desolate, silent battlefield into a spectacular and horrifying display of calculated operational devastation. The desert immediately erupted into a chaotic, violently explosive inferno of tearing metal and burning fuel. These highly advanced guided missiles inherently possessed a maximum engagement range that crucially allowed the elite operators to absolutely decimate the massive enemy motorized formations. They achieved this total destruction long before the heavily armed opposing forces could even visually identify the rapidly approaching threat on the distant, burning horizon. An enemy motorized column that confidently expected to effortlessly engage highly vulnerable light vehicles at extremely close range suddenly found its heavily armed lead elements obliterated. Precision munitions began violently falling seemingly from the empty, completely indifferent desert sky above. The sheer level of unparalleled psychological panic that instantly gripped the heavily outmatched opposing forces is a terrifying historical reality that officially censored reports constantly understate. The defending commanders quickly realized they were not fighting an army. They were hopelessly fighting an invisible, devastating phantom force. They simply could not reliably predict where the incredibly devastating next high-explosive strike was rapidly coming from in the vast emptiness, nor could they effectively communicate the rapidly changing, highly explosive threat picture to their utterly terrified and heavily disorganized subordinate defensive units. The incredibly vast, unyielding desert that should have reliably provided the ultimate defensive geographical advantage had been radically transformed into a terrifying, inescapable lethal trap. The unbelievable speed and surgical precision of the Australian operators violently weaponized the barren terrain against the deeply entrenched, highly arrogant indigenous defenders. The entire defending military architecture completely and spectacularly collapsed within the incredibly frantic first 48 hours of this relentless, highly aggressive high-speed desert campaign. The heavily armed enemy units were completely paralyzed by this relentless, highly aggressive, and totally unexpected adversary striking constantly. This invisible enemy aggressively moved significantly faster than their own internal command decision cycle could ever possibly process or realistically comprehend in the chaotic environment. This complete disruption of the enemy defensive orientation in the deeply contested western desert was a sensational tactical victory that absolutely defied all conventional logic. It aggressively contradicted the highly studied logic of open-terrain modern warfare taught to highly paid officers in massive, heavily funded global military institutions. The tiny Australian patrol elements consistently caught massive Iraqi motorized formations completely off guard and utterly defenseless. Sometimes operating with as incredibly few as 2 or 3 stripped-down, unarmored vehicles, these elite ghost units consistently initiated terrifying ambushes against massive defensive convoys. The indigenous forces simply could not effectively or forcefully respond to the utterly devastating, highly accurate performance of the incredibly advanced Javelin missile system deployed locally. It proved to be the absolute ultimate deciding factor that the highly paid, top-tier coalition planners had completely failed to appreciate during their endless pre-mission intelligence briefings. The massive enemy battalions were systematically slaughtered in the violently shifting dunes. The psychological impact of facing an adversary that you cannot see but who can absolutely destroy your heaviest vehicles with perfect precision is intensely devastating. The opposing Iraqi troops rapidly lost absolutely all cohesion, abandoning their heavily armed technicals and desperately fleeing into the unforgiving wilderness to escape the massive slaughter. The terrifying Australians ruthlessly exploited this massive, unprecedented tactical collapse pushing their highly modified rovers to their absolute mechanical limits to aggressively hunt down survivors. They violently ensured that the entire Western mobile defense grid was permanently and irreparably shattered. This absolutely staggering level of complete battlefield dominance was completely engineered by a force lacking any heavy armor, close air support, or standard logistical sustainment. The highly decorated American liaison officer watching this unbelievable massacre unfold entirely abandoned everything he previously believed about modern, heavily supported mechanized warfare and attrition. He personally witnessed absolute tactical perfection executed by a rogue unit perfectly adapted to weaponizing absolute aggression and unparalleled speed against a much larger indigenous force. The desert was permanently stained by the violent, perfectly executed wrath of Task Force 64. The sheer breathtaking violence of this deeply classified confrontation entirely neutralized the horrific, world-ending ballistic missile threat before a single catastrophic launch sequence could begin. The massive enemy defensive infrastructure heavily guarding the volatile Scud launchers was completely vaporized in a spectacular, unrecorded symphony of highly calculated operational destruction. The complete dismantling of the Western defenses was a tactical masterpiece, but it was merely a bloody stepping stone to a colossal discovery that would permanently alter global history. The true, unprecedented historical nightmare was still quietly waiting slightly ahead. Conventional planners believed capturing the colossal Al-Assad airbase intact was physically impossible. Task Force 64 arrived before the enemy could even strike a match. The incredible strategic significance of this massive military installation had been widely recognized by anxious coalition intelligence analysts for countless tense months before the massive invasion officially began. Located deep within the hostile and completely unforgiving western Al-Anbar province, this colossal facility was widely known across the globe as the absolute largest operational airbase in the entire fractured country. It was an absolutely massive, sprawling installation built specifically for aggressive aerial operations, featuring incredibly long runways easily capable of handling the absolute heaviest military aircraft. The highly intimidating base possessed heavily fortified hardened concrete shelters. These massive structures were deliberately designed to effortlessly survive incredibly close, near strikes from the absolute most powerful conventional munitions the Allied coalition currently possessed. A conventional, heavily armored ground force capable of safely reaching such a heavily fortified installation before an effective defense could be organized would frantically need to move significantly faster than any normal army. The massive enemy garrison fully expected plenty of advance warning before any foreign troops arrived. But the completely terrified enemy forces were rapidly and painfully learning that Task Force 64 was absolutely not a conventional military unit bound by the standard restrictive laws of logistics. The incredibly fast Phantom patrol elements aggressively converged on the massive airbase with an unbelievable, terrifying speed. They violently struck from multiple, completely unpredictable directions simultaneously under the dark cover of night. This perfectly coordinated, highly aggressive lightning strike deliberately left the massive enemy garrison with absolutely insufficient warning to organize any effective sustained defense or properly execute the controlled destruction of their base. The fiercely independent Australian operators completely secured the monumental facility with a level of terrifying efficiency that the global military establishment is still desperately trying to fully comprehend. The deeply entrenched indigenous defenders simply did not have enough precious time to desperately burn their highly classified intelligence documents. They failed to strategically detonate the critical concrete runways as standard military doctrine strictly prescribed when facing an overwhelming operational tragedy. The attached American officer could not believe his eyes as the incredibly massive gates were instantly breached and completely neutralized by the highly aggressive Phantom force. What the fiercely independent Australian operators dramatically uncovered hidden deep inside the sprawling base following its rapid violent seizure was a sensational discovery that genuinely defies all rational human belief. The absolute first mind-blowing revelation came when the heavily armed operators systematically secured the massive perimeter and aggressively began investigating the vast, empty stretches. They incredibly discovered more than 50 highly advanced combat aircraft perfectly hidden across the sprawling base. These expensive machines were placed in completely bizarre configurations that had been specifically designed to completely defeat highly sophisticated Allied aerial reconnaissance satellites passing overhead. The 50 buried fighter jets were a stunning intelligence coup, but they were absolutely nothing compared to the world-ending nightmare quietly resting in the subterranean bunkers. These incredibly lethal, highly expensive war machines had been meticulously concealed under massive layers of heavy camouflage netting. They were perfectly positioned in incredibly deep sand revetments to remain completely invisible from the extremely high altitudes where the standard coalition surveillance platforms constantly operated. Finding these buried jets immediately answered highly classified questions that had intensely occupied international intelligence analysts for countless frustrating years before the invasion. But the absolute most terrifying historical revelation was still quietly waiting in the unforgiving dark beneath the heavily secured concrete facilities. The incredibly massive ammunition stockpiles perfectly preserved at the newly captured desert facility represented a logistical reality far outside acceptable parameters. It was so incredibly staggering that the initial frantic field reports violently transmitted by the operators required multiple urgent confirmations before they were finally accepted. Top-tier generals sitting safely in heavily guarded American command centers absolutely refused to logically believe the terrifying numbers appearing directly on their classified operational screens. The absolutely staggering, incredibly terrifying figure that would eventually quietly appear in heavily redacted, completely declassified global security assessments revealed a nightmare. The operators uncovered nearly 8 million kilograms of highly destructive explosive material safely stored across the colossal, deeply entrenched military facility. That incredibly terrifying number is a sensational, completely mind-bending operational statistic that aggressively resists easy comprehension even for highly experienced military professionals. These seasoned logistical experts are intimately accustomed to constantly dealing in absolutely massive quantities of devastating ordnance during large-scale conventional global conflicts. To successfully provide a terrifying, completely comprehensible point of absolute reference for this entirely monumental and highly dangerous historical discovery, consider the American arsenal. The absolute largest conventional bomb in the entire United States inventory at that exact historical time contained approximately 9,000 kilograms of highly volatile explosives. The incredibly massive, completely overwhelming hidden stockpile miraculously secured at the sprawling airbase represented the terrifying equivalent of nearly 900 massive city-destroying weapons. All of this world-ending destructive potential was perfectly concentrated and stored in a single, incredibly vulnerable physical location. This absolutely apocalyptic amount of raw, unadulterated explosive power had been perfectly secured by an incredibly small Australian force, moving radically faster than anticipated. If this monumental, highly lethal stockpile had absolutely not been rapidly secured within the very first frantic hours of the chaotic desert invasion, disaster loomed. The massive facility would have been violently looted by highly aggressive insurgents during the incredibly dangerous post-invasion period that unfortunately followed the initial combat phase. Those illegally looted explosives would have tragically become the primary, incredibly devastating component of deadly improvised devices, claiming countless lives. The colossal, completely unprecedented stockpile at Al-Assad, had it been violently and rapidly dispersed into the turbulent countryside, would have unleashed an unprecedented tragedy. It would have aggressively armed an uncontrollable insurgency, guaranteeing absolute failure for the massive international military stabilization effort lasting over the following dark decade. These incredibly elite operators successfully neutralized an absolute nightmare of pure epic proportions long before the rest of the completely oblivious world even fully understood. They had incredibly and permanently achieved a monumental strategic victory that completely redefined the absolute limits of unconventional warfare operations forever. The highly classified operational reports meticulously documenting exactly what Task Force 64 miraculously accomplished finally reached the heavily guarded desks of the top American generals. They found themselves forcefully confronting a staggering assessment that fundamentally challenged their massive military culture and the absolute bedrock belief in overwhelming armored force. But when the cameras finally arrived to broadcast the glorious victory, the undisputed architects of this unprecedented campaign did something truly extraordinary. They simply vanished. They absolutely did not patiently wait around for shiny medals to be forcefully pinned to their exhausted, deeply bruised chests by smiling politicians. Nor did they eagerly seek highly lucrative mainstream book deals to loudly brag about their completely unprecedented, world-saving tactical exploits in the Western Desert. In a supreme, awe-inspiring display of the absolute ultimate quiet professional ethos, they simply turned their incredibly battered entirely unarmored desert vehicles entirely around. They drove silently back across the unforgiving, brutally scorching wasteland without ever desperately seeking any formal public recognition for preventing a massive global apocalypse. They quietly returned to the absolute secrecy of their highly restricted elite regiment, completely ignoring the screaming mainstream media broadcasting the victorious coalition narrative. They immediately went right back to intensely training for the exact next inevitable global tragedy, completely hidden from the absolutely oblivious public eye. This profound, absolute silence was strictly a deeply ingrained institutional military doctrine built completely on the firm understanding that future clandestine combat operations mattered most. These future, highly sensitive missions heavily depended on their global adversaries remaining completely ignorant of their terrifying tactical capabilities and unmatched high-speed operational proficiency. The monumental capability of Task Force 64 purposely remained completely invisible to the general public, precisely because their true operational picture remained highly classified. They remain the absolute ultimate silent legends of the entire modern tactical era, forever standing, firmly hidden in the deepest, most restricted shadows. They serve as the completely terrifying historical proof that the absolute greatest elite warriors do not require massive conventional armies to achieve absolute operational dominance. They permanently changed the entire course of human history using absolutely nothing but completely unarmored rovers, devastating precision missiles, and unmatched psychological endurance. Their perfectly executed desert campaign single-handedly prevented an apocalyptic Third World War, while the rest of the planet simply watched a meticulously fabricated television broadcast.